Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving into a fascinating piece of source material today that literally flips one of our most accepted economic narratives right on its head. You know the textbook story? Massive government wartime spending saved the U.S. from the depths of the Great Depression, right? Well, the data we're looking at today suggests, actually scratch that. It points to something entirely different. We're going to break down the numbers and see why this conventional wisdom might just be a massive statistical illusion.
So here's the big question. Did World War II actually save the economy? If you crack open almost any macroeconomics textbook, you're going to hit the classic Keynesian view. It basically says the Great Depression dragged on until the war forced the government into unprecedented spending, which created jobs and, boom, lasting prosperity. And on paper, the numbers seem to back that up perfectly. It feels like an open and shut case, but, as we'll see, looking only at the surface is exactly where things get messy.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The Wartime Prosperity Myth. Right after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. shifted gears hard into a massive war economy, generating something like 17 million jobs almost out of thin air. To put that crazy mobilization into perspective, defense spending exploded from a tiny 1.4% to over 37% of GDP. That is massive. Unemployment, which was stubbornly stuck around 15% in 1939, just plummeted below 2%. The source uses a hypothetical worker, Jeff, who gets called up to work at a Cleveland tank plant. For his family, they suddenly had a steady paycheck for the first time in years. So, looking at the stats, the American economy looked absolutely incredible. But here's the catch. That soaring GDP totally masked a really harsh ground-level reality. Let's think about Jeff and his family again. The source points out that despite this supposed statistical prosperity, they were living under some of the strictest rationing in U.S. history. Sugar coupons ran out. Meat allocations were cut to just 2 pounds per family for a whole week. Gas, coffee, cheese, even shoes were strictly rationed. Oh, you wanted to buy a new car? No way. Car production was literally banned starting in 1942. There's a great anecdote from the text where, when told the newspaper said they'd never been more prosperous, Jeff's wife joked she'd just tell the kids to eat the newspaper. And this leads us to an absolutely crucial point from the analysis. Quote, GDP goes up the same $10 million whether a family builds a house or the government builds a bomb and drops it into the sea. The source argues this wartime boom was heavily skewed, a statistical illusion. Sure, Americans were saving over 25% of their income, but it wasn't because of a sudden wave of financial responsibility. They were saving that much simply because there was literally nothing left to buy. Jeff was bringing home more cash than ever, but his family was eating less than when he was completely broke.
Moving on to Section 2, the post-war boom.
So, 1945 rolls around, and the guns finally go quiet. 10 million soldiers come home, and that giant engine of government spending gets slashed by over 60%. Now, if you believe government spending is the one and only pillar of economic health, this scenario looked absolutely terrifying. Experts back then, like Professor Paul Samuelson, predicted, and this is a quote, "Without government spending, we're looking at the greatest period of unemployment and industrial dislocation any economy has ever faced." Even President Truman and his advisors were echoing this, bracing for mass unemployment and an epidemic of violence. Basically, everyone at the top agreed that without that government cash flowing, America collapses.
But here's what actually happened. 3.9%. That was the actual peak unemployment rate after World War II. Those doomsday predictions? Completely wrong. Over 20 million people were released from war-related work, and the economy didn't collapse at all, it thrived. The source highlights how bomb factories rapidly shifted back to making appliances, and car plants swapped tanks for Chevrolets. Why did this work? Well, because the labor and resources that had been locked up in the war machine were finally flowing back into consumer goods, things people actually wanted and needed. So that traditional Keynesian prediction? It was tested in real time, and according to this source material, it just completely failed. All right, Section 3, the printing press trap. So if wartime spending didn't fix the economy, what did? The source argues we actually have to travel way back to 1914 to figure that out, and to understand the real root of all this economic instability. When World War I kicked off, countries had to mobilize on an unheard-of scale, and war is unbelievably expensive. Since you can only tax your citizens so much before they revolt, governments did what they usually do. They fired up the printing presses. But to do that, they had to ditch the gold standard, the rule that every dollar or pound was backed by physical gold. The huge problem here is that when the war ended in 1918, the printing definitely did not. By 1923, this unchecked printing led to absolute catastrophe, completely wiping out the savings of everyday citizens.
And this brilliantly illustrates what happened next, a global race to the bottom.
Countries realized that by constantly printing money, they could devalue their own currency to undercut their neighbors in international trade. France did it, Britain did it, but Germany printed so aggressively that it sparked infamous hyperinflation. We're talking a loaf of bread costing 200 billion marks. A housewife in Berlin literally needed a wheelbarrow full of cash just to go grocery shopping. So what happens when every country destroys its own money just to steal trade from its neighbors? You end up with money that absolutely nobody trusts. The source reports that this whole dynamic caused world trade to collapse by a staggering 66% between 1929 and 1934. And, as the analysis points out, this wasn't just some abstract economic crisis. It was a deeply human one. Starving, humiliated populations entirely lost faith in the system, and that paved a terrifyingly short path from the printing press to the rise of dictators standing on podiums promising to fix everything, which, of course, led directly right back to the battlefields of World War II.
Which brings us to Section 4, the Bretton Woods anchor.
Desperate to avoid repeating the massive monetary mistakes of the 20s and 30s, delegates from 44 nations got together in 1944 to establish the Bretton Woods system. Basically, every major global currency got pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar was rigidly fixed to gold at exactly $35 an ounce. The source describes this as an offensively boring but absolutely essential anchor. It put a hard stop on the printing presses. Governments couldn't just turn their currency into confetti anymore for a quick 6-month boost in exports. Money finally actually meant something again. According to the analysis, it was this return to stable, gold-backed money, not wartime spending, that actually drove the post-war economic boom. Take someone like Friedrich, a machinist in post-war Germany. His entire city is rubble, right? But because his money is tied to a system he can actually trust, he has the confidence to take out a loan, rebuild his shop, and hire workers. You multiply that by millions of people and you get immediate organic economic booms in places like Germany, Japan, and France. It works so well because the foundation was stable money that politicians couldn't just casually manipulate.
Section 5, the fall of gold.
Now, the Bretton Woods system had one pretty massive fatal flaw. It relied entirely on the United States behaving itself financially. And, for a while America did, but then the 1960s happened. The source details how America went on this massive spending spree, funding the Vietnam War overseas and expanding a vast welfare state through the Great Society programs at home. To pay for all that without hitting people with massive tax hikes, America just flooded the world with dollars. But here's the rub. The amount of physical gold sitting in Fort Knox, that stayed exactly the same. Suddenly, there were way more paper dollars floating around the globe than there was gold to actually back them up.
Well, this sparked international outrage and basically a global bank run on the United States. In 1965, France's president, Charles de Gaulle, looked at the math, realized it didn't add up, and demanded actual gold for France's dollars. By 1966, the U.S. had only $3.2 billion in gold to cover $14 billion in foreign claims. Yikes. By 1971, West Germany abandoned the system entirely, and Britain rolled up asking for $3 billion in gold. The bank was running dry. So, in August 1971, President Richard Nixon literally interrupted television broadcasts to announce that the U.S. would temporarily suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold. And, as we all know, that temporary measure became completely permanent.
The anchor was gone, and the aftermath was immediate and severe, unleashing the stagflation of the 1970s, that nasty combo of high inflation and stagnant growth. The source concludes that removing this anchor essentially set off decades of endless economic messes. We're talking 1974, 1979, the dot-com bust, 2008, right up to the inflation we feel today. Yet, every single time there's a crisis, the solution always seems to be printing more money. And the justification for it almost always traces back to that lingering, totally false myth that massive government spending during WWI was what fixes a broken economy.
Which leaves us with this incredibly profound thought from the source material to chew on. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. It really forces us to ask, are we relying on a historical illusion to justify policies that are destabilizing our own foundation today? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the consensus.